Welcome to Changing Minds. I'm your host, Joe Devlin. Society tends to idolize successful entrepreneurs. The Mark Zuckerbergs, the Richard Bransons, the Elon Musks. The world, they get a lot of attention for their immensely successful business, to the point that dressing up like Steve Jobs was a thing in Silicon Valley startups for a while. I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that maybe wearing a black turtleneck isn't a core feature of successful entrepreneurs, but I admit that I don't really know what does make them successful. Fortunately, my guest today is an expert in exactly that. Dr. Gorkan Ahmetoglu is an associate professor of business psychology at UCL, whose research specializes in identifying and supporting entrepreneurship. Welcome to Changing Minds, Gorkan.
Thanks very much, Joe.
I'm really pleased that you're here with us today. Before we get started, I'd just like to invite our audience to share any questions that you have for Gorkan in the Q&A board as we go, and then towards the end, we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. Gorkan, I'd love to start by just sort of asking how you would define entrepreneurship. What makes someone an entrepreneur?
All right, so I'll start with, the broader picture, which is that there's been quite a lot of debate about this, but really two core sort of definitions, and I've taken one of them. And I'll tell you which one is the most common, which I don't necessarily take, although I do from time to time use it. And I think it's the most common certainly in research, when you look at entrepreneurship research and what do we research. So, and there's a difference also between entrepreneurship and entrepreneur, but one follows the other. So I'll start simply by saying that generally when you think of entrepreneur, what researchers, and I think many lay people as well, will define it as someone who starts a business. It's as simple as that, and it's categorical, right? And then entrepreneurship is essentially the process of starting a business. So that's one definition. If you are a business owner, you founded a business or co-founded a business, you are an entrepreneur. If you haven't, then you're not an entrepreneur. It's very simple, right?
Then it's not the one you use.
It's not. It's not the one I like, really, because I'll tell you why. So when you look at the facts about entrepreneurs, because when we think about, entrepreneur, you think you have a positive image, someone who is, potentially charismatic risk taker, changes things, innovates, makes huge changes. So, I mean, you think of Facebook, you think of Apple and all of these companies that have been founded by entrepreneurs. But then when you look at the facts in terms of what is the typical entrepreneur, you see quite a different picture. So I'll just ask you a simple question, or the audience, just to think about for a few seconds. What do you think most entrepreneurs, 70%, have in common? Do you care to guess?
If I had to guess, they don't succeed, would be my guess. Is that true, or is that just too...
That is true, yeah. So I had one audience member once when I was giving a talk saying they're prepared to fail. And I said, it's an interesting answer. I'm not sure if they're prepared, but they do fail, right? So it's like most of them do, well, 70% of entrepreneurs fail. That's just facts, and that's in the developing world. This is US data, similar in the UK. And then 90% never actually grow. So imagine you have 90% of all entrepreneurs never actually grow their business. It's like a mom and pop shop. So when you say an entrepreneur and you think of the sort of, the game changer, and then you look at a typical entrepreneur, there's a huge difference there. And when you ask 98% of entrepreneurs, you ask them, would you like to innovate, or are you intending to innovate with your business? Are you intending to change things and then change the market or introduce something new to the market? 98% of entrepreneurs say no. It's pretty far from what our image, I mean, let alone, innovating.
Right.
They don't even want to. So you can imagine that there's a very small percentage of entrepreneurs which constitute the picture that we have in our minds, and the picture that we have from media generally, which is, those game changers essentially. And so there's also another thing that, the other reason to why I think there's a misconception there in that definition, and why I don't particularly think it's interesting to study it, because my view is, well, why would I study relatively unsuccessful business owners, if you say, I mean, just relative to employed individuals from a psychological point of view, like why do people become entrepreneurs? Well, the most common reason is because they can't get a job. There's no employment. So when you look at, and I tend to ask this to my students, which is, and I've done it in so many talks, and it's incredible. You ask it to entrepreneurs, you ask it to VCs, whatever. The question is, which country has the most entrepreneurs? What do you think is the most common response that I get?
I would have thought the US.
Correct. This is the most common response. Yet when you look at the OECD countries, it's the least entrepreneurial country. It's the country which has the least entrepreneurs in the whole OECD. so it's very untypical. So the point is, why do people start a business? Why do people become entrepreneurs? Because they can't get a job. When there's a good job market, you don't become an entrepreneur. So the country with the most entrepreneurs in the world is New Guinea in Africa. And then Rwanda, I think, is the second. And then lots of sort of poor countries. So there's almost like quite a decent correlation between how poor your country is and how many entrepreneurs you have as a percentage of total employment. So that's why I don't think it's, from a psychological point of view, if I want to know what is the makeup of the entrepreneur, of Steve Jobs, right, I don't look at the typical entrepreneur, right? So it wouldn't make any sense.
Well, maybe I should reframe my question then and say, okay, so what makes someone a successful entrepreneur?
Yeah, so the way I've thought about it is the other definition, which is essentially entrepreneurship is, and this is also a well-established definition, but it's more like people don't use it, or don't operationalize it, or don't measure it in that sense, which is the recognition and exploitation of opportunities. So recognizing and exploiting opportunities to create value. And generally some innovation is sort of put in there, right? Because I think there's quite a big overlap between the concept of innovation and the recognition and exploitation of opportunities and the creation of value, right? So that's the sort of definition I'd like to take, because then you can also say, well, that makes sense, but because creating value by recognizing and exploiting opportunities surely is a good thing, right? This is clearly what you want to predict from a psychological or an economic perspective. So when I started looking at who is an entrepreneur, or from a psychological point of view, what is the entrepreneurial personality? Yeah. Like it was essentially easiest to look at not what makes people choose a business ownership or as a career, but who are the people who tend to recognize and exploit valuable opportunities, right? So this is what I thought, well, that seems to be a good endeavor to try to understand that. So we've done lots of research on that, on looking at, can we, from almost like a personality perspective, look at the entrepreneurial personality from the perspective of, can we look at people who tend to recognize and exploit valuable opportunities, but those, as you can imagine, an academic can do that, right? It doesn't have to be a business owner. I mean, sure, us academics, we have individual differences in how good we are at recognizing and exploiting opportunities and creating change. You can be an employee, you can be a manager in an existing organization and do that. So the research that we've done is basically looking at trying to measure sort of the characteristics of people who recognize and exploit opportunities, and see, well, can we get to that psychological profile, and can we then predict something that's useful?
Sure.
Let's say. So we've done a lot of research on that, and I'm assuming sort of that's where we want to go with the next topic, right?
Right. Well, in fact, that was what I was gonna ask then, is, can you tell us a little bit about, one, how you kind of go about that? Because that sounds complicated given the diversity of the definition. And then two, what kind of things have you found? Are there personality traits that predict this? Yeah.
So first of all, we did it in a very simple way, because this sort of definition of the recognition of exploitation of opportunities is an agreed definition, but we had to sort of dig a bit in the literature and research, and try to find those themes. Those themes came out. Then we said, look, the simplest way of doing it is just to ask people in a psychometric questionnaire or like personality questionnaire type thing, like, are you a person who regularly recognizes opportunities? Are you a person who regularly exploit opportunities once you've recognized it? You ask it in many different ways, of course. You know, do you have a desire to change things for the better, or do you have a desire to change the world, to make it a better place? Like, how ambitious are you in that sense? How creative are you? How much do you want to innovate and things like that? So just sort of literally asking people, to what extent are they entrepreneurial? Are they exploiting and recognizing opportunities? And we did find that those particular tendencies, I call them psychological and behavioral tendencies, i.e. to recognize an opportunity. And of course, there's a difference between a tendency and an ability, right? So you might be someone who recognizes opportunities all the time, but you might not be very good at you might not spot very good opportunities, right? Your opportunities are just sort of bad ideas kind of thing. Sure. But we just looked at whether those people who reported recognizing and exploiting opportunities, whether they actually did something in the real world. And again, this is now 10 years of research. We found this consistently with both entrepreneurs and people within organizations, that if you score higher on these tendencies, and people tend to be quite honest about it. So if you aren't a person who regularly would, like once you see an opportunity to exploit it, which is quite a difficult thing to do, if you report not being it, it seems like you're far less likely to actually do things that are traditionally considered as successful entrepreneurship or intrapreneurship. So the latest study is a quite interesting one, which is with the largest entrepreneurial research project in the world, if you like. Global Entrepreneurship Monitor does this study every year with 155,000 people in 50 different countries. And basically, they included our sort of psychometric tests for the first time last year and looked at what makes national and internationally successful entrepreneurs. So a business owner with national and international impact, and found that if you scored, let's say, 4.5 out of 5 instead of 1.5 out of 5, i.e. if you're highly entrepreneurial versus not very highly entrepreneurial, your chances of becoming a national or international level, or an entrepreneur with national and international level impact, increases by 300%.
Wow.
So the question of to what extent can psychology or the psychological profile, and maybe even more granular than that, a psychometric test, predict whether you are national or internationally impactful entrepreneur? That's the answer. It's quite a huge effect, and we find similar, like with all of our other studies, we do studies internationally with both large organizations, but also microfinance institutions. We find very similar results.
So how do they determine that you have impact then? Like, I can see how they use your profiling tool to get a measure of your entrepreneurial sort of latent skills, but how do they decide, you're the next, well, you have been a Steve Jobs versus you have been a Joe Blogs?
There are different ways of doing it. So you can just look at people's revenues, for instance, or profits, or the size of the business, number of employees, assets, things like that, or just self-reported, do you sell internationally? Do you have a business internationally? Do you have a business nationally, or is it a local business? So there are a number of different ways of measuring impact. And sometimes we get data from accelerators and venture capital firms, where they essentially rank companies as high impact companies. Right. And generally those companies will have 20 to 30% growth year on year for the last 3 years. in terms of employees or revenues. But yeah, it will be all the traditional metrics. And then you could also add like how innovative a product has been that they've launched, essentially. So there are a number of ways of doing it. Yeah.
Well, I can imagine that kind of a profiling tool would be incredibly valuable for accelerators or venture capitalists or angel investors, things like that. Do they use that, or is that mostly done by, that sort of dragon den gut feeling sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's mostly done well, the psychological profiling bit. They will have their due diligence on the business side of things.
Sure.
So just there's a long process there. Not that, okay. So I was going to say that there are biases in every evaluation that you make, but this is pretty hardcore evaluation of economic and experience and things like that. But the psychological profiling generally, and this is not my view, most accelerators, VCs will tell you this, they do it by gut feel, right? So looking at the pitch of the entrepreneur, just having the chemistry there, and a lot of it is the dragon den style. Dragon den is essentially, they do have very little time. Yes. Often accelerators, venture capitalists, angel investors, very little time to spot the right person. And so a lot of it is gut feel, which is why, a very common question that I get from those kinds of institutions is, can we do it slightly more standard, in a slightly more standardized way, in a slightly more scientific way, if you like?
Sure.
So I feel there's a definite trend to use science and psychometric testing in particular in the VC world, angel, and accelerators world. So I think they're sort of getting more warm to the idea.
Okay, well, that sounds very positive, particularly if the tool is able to predict such a dramatic difference between low and high entrepreneurial success rates. That's remarkable. It does raise a question then that I feel like as a psychologist, I should ask more than I do about that sort of nature-nurture side of things. Are people born with these entrepreneurial skills, or can they be trained? Can they learn them?
So yeah, it is an old question, isn't it? And the simple answer is, as with any personality characteristics out there, there's some heritability, right? I think the latest figure is like 45% heritable, but at the same time, there's stability there. So when we've done it, I found that quite interesting, because the way I see entrepreneurial traits are sort of slightly on the lower level of these big five, if anyone is familiar with the sort of standard personality trait. But what we've seen is that these traits are quite stable. So over 8-year period, we did a retest reliability, and the correlations are quite high, even over an 8-year period. So it's almost 0.7. So people don't change very much is one answer to that. But the correlation isn't one. So,
but there's some scope.
Exactly. Even the heritability studies seem to suggest that there is scope for change. It's just that most people don't. So if you try to engage in systematic change, you probably could do it. And there is some evidence with some of these traits, especially proactivity, done with some collaborators that we have. They did some great research where they changed the proactivity level of entrepreneurs and then looked at their profits 1 year and 2 year on, I think, and looked at and saw a 30% increase in profits relative to a control group who did just business training, regular sort of entrepreneurship training.
Well, I can imagine that if you're a government trying to promote innovation in small business and startups, or even if you're an organization and you just think, look, I'm a large company that has a lot of employees, therefore many of them within the organization will have these kind of entrepreneurial skills. How do I promote that? How do I get the most out of them and encourage them to reach their full potential? That does sound like there's some encouragement here that there is potential to develop some of those skills.
Absolutely. I think especially when you talk about organizations, large corporates, it's very difficult to see whether someone is entrepreneurial purely because it's very difficult to observe. Those behaviors are just not encouraged or sometimes even allowed, right? So you might be really entrepreneurial, but not an entrepreneur, if you like. So you're not actually sort of displaying those behaviors. So So there's quite a lot to do there for organizations, I would feel. And I think there's a huge potential for organizations to identify individuals by psychometric profiling rather than trying to see who is actually contributed to the organization with new ideas and innovations. Because if the culture doesn't allow you to do it, you're very unlikely to see those individuals come forward in the first place.
And presumably it has different value to some organizations relative to another. I mean, if you're doing something that's traditional and it's been the way it's been done for 100 years and the company's been successful, then maybe you're not really looking for that. Whereas some young, hungrier companies might be very much sort of looking for competitive edge that gets them at the, to the big table.
Yeah, I mean, I have two answers to that. One is it's the comment that you made on, if you've been successful for so long, why change anything? I think most companies nowadays don't feel that anymore. I think most companies feel that, you kind of have to keep innovating because innovation is happening too quick and too big to be complacent with our history. And the second is, it's true that, some organizations wouldn't want to have too many entrepreneurial individuals or even innovate too much. But I don't even see it as you have to be the next Facebook. It's just like, if you're a law firm, you just have to be slightly more entrepreneurial than another law firm or the rest of the law firms to be the entrepreneurial law firm, if you see what I mean, right? So you have to sort of have the right comparison group.
Fair enough. I'm sensitive to the time, and I see that there are some questions here that people have asked. So if you don't mind, I'd like to turn to the audience questions. Is that okay?
Of course.
Fantastic. There's one here from Lee saying, would the psychometric test be useful in industry when hiring people in the long term? Wouldn't applicants simply learn to respond in a certain way? And are there more implicit sort of non-self-report measures of assessing these entrepreneurial tendencies that might be worth looking into as well?
Yeah, so two different questions there. Let me see which one I start with. Are there different, let me start with the latter one, which is, are there different measures for this? And, we're certainly trying. So we are currently doing a situational judgment test. So where you're not asked whether you are a person doing something, but you're asked which particular option you would choose out of 4 options, let's say, that seem quite similar to one another. And thereby we evaluate whether you are more or less likely to be a successful entrepreneur. Other things are like reaction time, so far more implicit level measures. Game-based assessment, let's say, is something that we've looked at, found some interesting stuff there. So there's certainly things out there, not very well validated, I should say, yet. So we don't know the accuracy or the reliability of these tests. But when it comes to the self-report measure, we haven't seen this learning effect. So I'll give you the best example of this. There are 2 reasons for that. I mean, but the best example of this is a company that we work for, and they've probably profiled over 1 million people now using psychometric testing. It's with microfinance institutions where people have no credit score, no bank account details, so the bank can't actually lend to them. So the alternative is to use a psychometric test and see, and so the way you do it is, you see whether the psychometric test predicts whether you will default, i.e. whether you will not pay back the loan. And obviously that's what your bank and credit score and bank account history does, right? So can the psychometric test do the same as the credit history? And we see that it does it either as well or better than the credit history. So you can certainly predict whether someone will default or not. But just to sort of stick to the point, is that people there either get a loan or not, depending on how they score on the psychometric test. And still we don't see that they fake it, if you see what I mean. So they still don't game the test, even though they know that they will be they know that the bank will lend them the loan or not based on how they score. So we don't see too much of that faking bit or gaming the test bit that you would think would happen, really.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another great question here from Matthew saying, what would the main things you suggest organizations can do to promote entrepreneurial behavior among the staff?
I would say there are 2 things to think about here. you have to have the people and you have to have the culture. So it's a very simple suggestion, because the real answer is much more complex and should be taken within a particular context. I don't think I can have a general answer for all industries and all sizes of organization. But one thing that's probably going to be true for most organizations is that first, you have to have people who have the willingness, psychological tendency to want to recognize and exploit opportunities and create change and create value. And the second, they have to have the ability to have good ideas, because a lot of people might have ideas, but not very good ones, like I said. So the right people have to be there, because no matter how much you spend on, decorating your office and giving people 20% time off to work on ideas, if you have people who are not very interested in doing it, you're still not going to be very successful with your sort of efforts to be innovative. And then the opposite is true as well. And we see this in our research as well, this kind of interaction effect of you can't have one without the other, is even if you hire lots of people, you steal Facebook's and Apple's employees, the talents, let's say, but then you have managers who are totally uninterested in listening to their ideas, you're not going to have a very innovative organization. So you kind of have that interaction effect. So if you have zero in either culture or people, you're going to have zero in the output, right? It's not just an additive effect where a bit of both or one and slightly more of the other is good. You kind of have to have both there for it to be successful. That's the simple answer to a very complex question, I would say.
Cool. And there have been a number of questions here along similar lines. I'm just going to pick one from Victor saying, my understanding is that famous entrepreneurs like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, etc., have very strong extrovert, and some might even describe harsh personalities. Is that characteristic of successful entrepreneurs, or can you be more on the introvert side and still be a successful entrepreneur?
No, there's certainly evidence to suggest that you can be on the introvert side and be a successful entrepreneur. And I mean, the whole sort of the dark side traits, if you like, what psychologists sometimes call them, that's a very interesting phenomenon, because we do see it correlating with successful entrepreneurship. But whether it's a cause is an interest. So whether it's because or despite of is we're still unsure. The way I see it is that we've done some research on the entrepreneurial personality. So people who are more entrepreneurial, they tend to be higher on primary psychopathy, right? So
it doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't, right? So they're more manipulative. They have less sort of they're less caring and things like that. But they're not reckless or risk taking, which is secondary psychopathy. So entrepreneurial people tend to have these dark side traits. But so the more entrepreneurial you are, the more of the dark side you are likely to have. I just think that it's a bit of a ticking time bomb. The higher that goes, right, the more risk you have of big failure, but also the more likelihood you have of innovation. So it's kind of like disruption in the two sense of the word, like disruptive innovation or socially disruptive, right? So you can go either way, I would say, the higher you are, which is why you probably also see very famous failures as well, like firms failing really big. I think it's a sort of high gamble or a high risk gamble there.
So it's a sort of go big or go home approach.
Pretty much.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm sensitive to the time, and I'm aware that we're running out here. So I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you, Gorkan, for a really fabulous and stimulating discussion. I certainly had never really thought about entrepreneurship in those terms before.
My pleasure, Joe. Really good speaking to you.
Thanks again. And then next week, we will be talking about messenger effects. I look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks again, Gorkan, and thanks everybody else. Take care.
Cheers.